Welcome to our 11th weekly webinar. And I'm sorry if you hear any dog noises in the background. There's too many dogs here today. I have some visiting dogs. Today we're featuring a rare victory. Hamid Hayat was released from prison last year after spending 14 years on a wrongful conviction. A few months ago, the charges were completely dropped. His extraordinary story has been featured in a number of criminal justice series, the Confession Tapes on Netflix, the Wrongful Conviction False Confessions podcast, and Wrongful Conviction with Jason Flom, among others. We're proud to have him and two of his lawyers here today to discuss his case, its toll on him, and how he's doing now. Hamid Hayat is of Pakistani descent, and he was living in Lodi, California with his family. Soon after 9/11, he was targeted by a very deceitful undercover FBI informant. And I got to say, that's redundant because the FBI actually chooses these guys because they're good liars, and they're more accurately called provocateurs. So the informant befriended Hamid, and Hamid tried to impress him. He was this older, rich, cool guy, pretending to be rich. Well, he was rich now because he was getting paid by the FBI a lot of money. Hamid told the informant what he wanted to hear. And after a lot of prodding and manipulation, Hamid told the informant he had actually gone to a terrorist training camp while in Pakistan. This was completely untrue, but it led to his arrest and then a false confession and his conviction at trial. He was sentenced to 23 years. Many years later, his new attorneys were able to present evidence showing that he was innocent. After a hearing, he was granted a new trial and released. The government finally gave up and dropped the charges. It's almost impossible, even for wrongfully convicted people, especially in a case without DNA evidence, to win a new trial. So this is really an amazing victory. In addition to Hamid, we have two members of his legal team with us. We have Dennis Riordan. He's one of the premier appellate litigators in the United States. This year, he was selected as the 2020 Appellate Lawyer Hall of Fame recipient by the California Lawyers Association and honored with the 2020 Champion of Justice Award by the National Lawyers Guild. In 2005, while listing Dennis among the top 10 lawyers in the Bay Area, the San Francisco Chronicle named him the last hope, and I think he was Hamid's last hope to get out. Well, not just him, but his team. And then we also have Don Horgan, who's a partner with Dennis. He's been representing criminal defendants at the trial and appellate levels since the 1980s, and he founded Riordan and Horgan with Dennis in 2003. Don was very involved in getting a new trial for one of the men wrongfully convicted in the West Memphis 3 case and getting him released in 2011. Among other awards, he won the 2012 Justice Award from the Innocence Project, and he was prominently featured in Paradise Lost 3, Purgatory, the HBO documentary on the West Memphis 3 case. I want to start with Hamid. We were overjoyed to hear you were released, and we're very happy to have you with us today. Can you tell us what it was like to hear that you actually won your motion and were released last year?
Thank you very much for having me. First of all, I highly appreciate it. Honestly, when I received that phone call from Dennis, my unit manager came and told me, "Hey, you have a legal call." And as soon as I stepped in the office, she said, "You have some good news," and I'm like, "Okay." And as soon as I got on the phone and Dennis told me we won, I was shocked, and I couldn't believe it, honestly, especially from the decision from the district judge, because I was not expecting getting anything back from the district court. I was expecting we're gonna lose and we have to go further. But I was really shocked, honestly, when Dennis told me that. I couldn't believe it. I can't hear you.
Okay, sorry about that. So it must have also been very difficult for you to lose so many years of your life. What would you say was the hardest part or some of the hardest things about being in prison for 14 years?
Absolutely, it was hard, no doubt. But I had my family, my legal team, and supporters like CCF, other organizations were there, and just one day at a time. It was hard, no doubt, but my faith, and I just kept on pushing.
Yeah, not giving up. Um, were you ever in a CMU, a communication management unit?
Yes, I was in both of them. I was in first. I started off in Terre Haute, Indiana. I was there for about 15 months, and then he transferred me to the USP Marion one, and I was there for about 18 months before I went to population.
Can you talk a little bit about what it was like being in the CMU as opposed to a regular prison?
Well, it was at beginning I really didn't know what was going on until somebody explained to me that, hey, this is different than a regular population, like general population. And I'm like, okay, and it was hard actually. It was really hard compared to population because you're only getting one phone call per week with your family and 4 hours of non-contact visit per month. Yeah, it was 4 hours a non-contact visit per month at the time. Yeah, it was hard, but honestly, had good people around me, other people who were similar charges. We gave hope to each other, been there for each other, supporting each other.
Yeah, that's what I've heard about the CMUs, that maybe the worst part is that you can never hug your loved ones at all, no matter that they have to travel sometimes for days to be able to see you, and then they have to go in a little room and just talk over the phone, and sometimes that doesn't even work, but that there's other good people there in a similar situation, like you said. Um, so, Hamid, what advice do you have for other people who are also convicted unfairly or sentenced unfairly and are still trying to fight their cases or just deal with the situation?
Never give up. I mean, I didn't give up. It took me a long time, but I didn't give up. I never thought about giving up, honestly. I never ever did. Once Dennis took over the case and Don and the team, I never did. Yes, before that, when trial and all that, yes, I had thoughts and everything, but once the appeal and everything went through, like it was going forward, I was like, no, not gonna happen. Regardless of what the uh, outcome is, I'm not giving up. I'd rather fight to the end.
Yeah. All right. Well, good thing you did. And what have you been up to since your release? If you want to say whatever you want to share about that.
Uh, I recently started working and working on my education too, and just connecting with family members and community. I have nieces and nephews who were born after me, connecting with them. That's pretty much it.
Nice. Do you want to, you mentioned education. What, do you have any particular plans for the future that you want to mention, and what kind of
No,
things are you studying?
no, not really right now. I just want to. I didn't get a chance to finish my high school diploma in there, so I'm working on that. After that, I would rather move on to college.
Okay. So I guess you'll figure out what you want to do with that, but enjoying your freedom for now.
Yes, it's truly a blessing, and honestly, still feels like a dream. I'm not gonna lie. At times, I wake up and look around and I'm like, is this real? I still can't believe it. Certain days, I'm like, this got to be a dream. Like, so used to being in prison, being institutionalized, so my mind's still kind of like in prison. So
Yeah, I don't know what that's like personally, but I've heard that it's hard to readapt once you get out. And do you want to talk about that a little more, or just leave it at that for now?
no, sure, we can talk about it. I'm slowly adjusting. Honestly, even like I'm really thankful that I have a job because with that really helps me. I have a routine now with that. Like my mind's off a lot of stuff. I don't really stress like depression or nothing, none of that. Like it's more easier for me to sleep at night. I can focus now easier on everything else, and it's with the job, it's just much easier for me to focus on everything else. So I'm just moving slowly, and it's gonna take time, but I'll heal.
All right. Well, thank you. We're so glad you're out and so glad you could do this webinar with us.
Thank you very
I'd
much.
like to turn now to Dennis Riordan and just ask Dennis, how did you get involved in Hamid's case in the first place?
Well, it was highly publicized, and not only in the nation, it was a huge worldwide story when the FBI announced that there had been a sleeper cell of Al Qaeda in Lodi, California, and arrested Hamid and his father. Even by the end of the case, and with the conviction, they had to admit that the Al Qaeda stuff was just all made up, and there was no conceivable connection to Al Qaeda. But with the publicity, we read articles about it. We weren't following it very closely, but we certainly had the impression that it was quite a weak case. And upon the conviction, there immediately surfaced stories that there had been juror misconduct, particularly by the foreman of the jury. And juror misconduct is an issue that myself and my office had handled successfully on a number of occasions in the Ninth Circuit. So we actually called Hamid's trial attorney and asked if she'd want some assistance in what was going to be a post-trial new trial motion based initially, certainly we knew, on juror misconduct. And she accepted that offer, and we got into the case and on a volunteer basis. But it was a surprising thing because the trial attorney, and there'll be more about this, had she had been retained counsel in theory and made an application to be appointed for the purpose of post-trial motions. And those were granted only on the grounds that we come in to assist because she actually did not have the qualifications to be court appointed in the case.
I see. So one of the big parts of this case was that there was a false confession, and there was, I believe, a videotape of at least part of that interrogation. And when you reviewed that, and this next series of questions can be for either you or Don, and you can decide which one answers them, or you can both answer them. But looking at that interrogation, how did you know that that was a false confession, or it seemed like a false confession?
Well, I wasn't an expert in false confessions at the time. I learned a lot in the course of this case, but very quickly, number one, the trial lawyer said that, and she was absolutely convinced that it was false, and she knew that there were any number of witnesses in Pakistan who, because the accusation here was that Hamid was born in the United States and grew up in Lodi, but spent time back and forth in Pakistan, had gone to Pakistan, and he had to get married and to assist his mother getting some medical treatment. And they alleged that while he was there, he had gone to a jihadi camp. And the trial lawyer informed us that there were any number of people who could testify that he absolutely hadn't done any of that. But in her view, she unfortunately was unable to present them that evidence at trial because the people were in Pakistan. That became a huge part of the ineffective assistance claim that followed. But she was convinced of that. Secondly, if you saw the tapes of the interview themselves, it was preposterous. Hamid said at the beginning he wanted to help his country. They put him through this 14-hour interrogation, and they used all of the tactics which produce false confession. Most notably, they said that they had pictures of him in a training camp, and it was a lie. They absolutely did not. The quality of it, the fact that they ask him questions and he gives 6 different answers. He was obviously exhausted. At one point, he just said, "I don't care if you put me in jail, just somewhere where I can lie down." He had recently come back from Pakistan and was utterly exhausted. So it had all of the indicia of a false confession. And the most important thing, and this is the most stunning thing, is that at trial, the lead FBI agent admitted that they had no evidence that he had gone to a camp other than the confession. There was absolutely no corroboration there. And if there's a single indicia of a false confession, it's that there's no objective evidence to support its truth and validity.
So, I mean, doesn't there have to be some corroboration, or did they do that through the informant? Or is there not that requirement?
There is, of course, it's very thin, and that issue had not been raised at trial until we came in to do the post-trial motions. Let me just detail two things, and we'll come back to them because they're so important. They claim that the fact that Hamid had a supplication, an Islamic supplication, a prayer in his pocket, was proof that he was a terrorist, because only a terrorist would have this prayer. Only terrorists carried around this Islamic supplication. We'll say some more about that, but the fact that an expert could say that for reasons I'll detail was just perjury. Only terrorists carried around. This is a very, very common supplication. And so that was the principal thing that they relied on to claim that the confession was corroborated.
I see. That's interesting about them using a regular prayer that lots of people have. It reminds me of how in the Holy Land case, the prosecution actually tried to claim that Salam Alaikum was a terrorist greeting, and it means peace be with you. And of course, Muslims say that all the time. There's just so much. What was
in Southeast Asia and Pakistan, Muslims carry tweezers, which are basically what Christians might think of as a St. Christopher medal, a prayer or an emblem, an amulet that you carry as protection and safeguarding, particularly when you travel. It's an extraordinarily common practice. And as I say, the expert who said that anyone in the world who carried this particular supplication was a terrorist was someone who at the beginning of the case knew so little about the practices of Pakistanis and Pakistani Muslims that he was sending emails to people in Pakistan saying, has anybody ever seen this prayer before and what's it used for? And received back the information that this was a common prayer used by people in Pakistan and worldwide for that matter. And yet he gets on the stand and swears under the penalty of perjury that only a terrorist ever carries a prayer like this.
Yeah, that sounds like the kinds of things that prosecutors do in these cases when they just really want convictions. It's terrible. So we've mentioned the false confession. We've mentioned the unfair use of this prayer. You mentioned something about juror misconduct and the way the informant dealt with him too. Are there any other unfair circumstances that led to this conviction, and I guess the inexperience of his attorney? Is there anything else you want to mention in terms of the things that led to the conviction unfairly?
Well, Don will take it on some of the other circumstances, and we'll have to be relatively brief because it's just stunning how many things contributed and how to contribute to convicting an innocent man in this way. But Don, you want to take it on some of the, and a lot of this was attributed to the inexperience of the lawyer.
Because the lawyer didn't know to
I
object.
think Don may be on mute, right? No, I think, why don't you ask him if he is?
Can you hear me?
There you go. Okay.
Awesome. Okay. Yeah, actually the inexperience of counsel was the principal basis on which we actually won the case ultimately. But it really was a huge factor through which a lot of the other errors kind of got filtered. So Dennis mentioned, for instance, in the early interviews that we did with the trial lawyer, Wajma Mojedidi, that she knew that there were witnesses who could have testified at Hamid's trial that in fact, during this 3 to 6 month period when he supposedly was off at a terrorist training camp, he in fact was in his home village of Babudi and never left there, but for 2 occasions during the relevant 2-year period. He went on 2 trips to Multan, each time for about a week. So for the remainder of the period that he was in Pakistan between 2003 and 2005, he never left Babudi for more than a week. He sometimes went up to Rawalpindi on short visits to bring his mother up there for medical treatment. And there were 17 witnesses to this, including members of his own family, but also friends and relatives in Babudi. Yet the trial lawyer, because of her inexperience, simply wasn't aware that there was a mechanism, and there is, under the federal rules of criminal procedure that would have allowed her to get the testimony of those witnesses in front of a jury here. They could be deposed over there and have their testimony could have been presented here. She simply didn't understand that that was an available route. She was also, so a huge part of the case was, or a major blunder was the failure to get that exculpatory testemony. It wasn't that the trial lawyer wasn't dedicated and very keen on winning, but she had never been in a criminal case before. I think she was 3 years out of law school, never done a jury trial, never done really any criminal, handled any criminal matter at all, really, much less in federal court, and was simply outgunned. And another contributing factor beyond that, well, let me backtrack. Failure to present the alibi testimony from multiple witnesses was a huge error. Another one was the failure to put on an expert, and Dennis touched on this, who would have, who was available at the time, who would have testified that supplication that Hamid had in his wallet when he was in Pakistan and when he was arrested is in fact not a sinister, warlike kind of material that a jihadist would carry, but it's simply, as Dennis said, akin to a St. Christopher medal for a Christian. It's an innocent and widely used paper or prayer that Muslim travelers carry with them, very common. And there were witnesses, more than one, expert witnesses who were available and could have testified that this had a totally innocent purpose and meaning. And another huge part, there were other, I'll just quickly, I mean, there was a failure to present a false confession expert. That played a huge role in the case because, again, that could have been very persuasive to a jury that, by the way, took, I think, almost 10 full days to convict. They were very torn with this case. It was a very close case. The trial lawyer never presented a false confession expert. And finally, maybe Dennis can touch on this a little bit. There was we alleged a conflict of interest between Hamid's trial lawyer and the lawyer for Hamid's father, who was tried with Hamid, and he was represented by a much more experienced federal practitioner. So we alleged that there was a conflict of interest. And Dennis, I don't know if you want to just expand on that a little bit. But.
Well, and I'm joining Don now on the same camera. The trial lawyer eventually, in our discussions with her, said, well, of course I was unqualified to represent Hamid. I had no experience, but we were going to do a team defense, and the father's lawyer would fill me in, and I'd learn on the job. And we raised with her initially, well, you know, you can't take direction. You can have team defenses, but you cannot take direction from a co-defendant's lawyer because the interests are different. And of course, the father was charged with making a false statement in Sacramento, and the son was charged with attending a camp in Pakistan. There was there were connections between the two cases, but one demanded on-the-ground investigation, and of course the supplication was evidence only against the son as against the father, and essentially Hamid's lawyer operated only at the direction of his father's lawyer, which led to a complete failure to prepare a defense and to investigate the evidence on the ground in Pakistan. So in that sense, it was really a tragic fiasco at trial. Hamid never had a separate defense. And in fact, the fact that the jury took so long to return a verdict, and we later learned that the foreman's attitude basically was, well, I mean, they may or may not have really proved him guilty beyond a reasonable doubt, but we can't take risks. We have to err on the side of caution in post 9/11 cases. All added to the fact that Hamid was convicted, and the fact that it took so long indicated that even with all of the absence of evidence in his case, some members of the jury, even with that, did not want and did not believe that Hamid should be convicted.
Yeah, I understand that that in these post 9/11 cases where Muslims are charged with terrorism, it's as if the burden of proof is kind of flipped on its head, where they're afraid to acquit. I've seen that happen in other cases too. I just wanted to talk a little bit about the father, because my understanding is he was also interrogated and gave a false confession, but his false confession was so ridiculous that nobody could present it in court with a straight face. So he didn't get charged with going to the training camp, but he made up a lot of crazy stuff just to try to get out of the interrogation, I guess. Whereas it sounds like with Hamid that he was fed the information by the FBI and just kind of gave it back to them, and they were able to build even though it was a flimsy case against.
Well, there were aspects of Hamid's statement that were equally ridiculous. As I say, they'd ask him where the camp was, and he'd come up with 6 different locations, and they were very frustrated because he never ever gave them the kind of information that they wanted and that he would have had if any of this thing had been true. But just as one example, at some point they said, "Now, who gave you your marching orders?" And he said, "What are marching orders?" And they said, "Well, that's where people tell you what to do and what you're supposed to do. And so how did you get your marching orders?" And he said, "Well, I don't know. Maybe they were going to send me a letter." The FBI,
And it was the FBI giving him his marching orders.
With terrorist instructions in there, and you must have gotten them from the imams and at the local mosque and so forth. It was silly, but when it came to the dad, who swore on the Quran that neither he nor Hamid had ever been near a training camp, and when they broke him down, then he gave a description of an underground camp where people in ninja suits were pole vaulting underground and so forth and so on. And it just descended into the insanity. And as he said later, it was kind of all lifted from a Ninja Turtle movie.
Ninja Turtle suits is what they were wearing. Yeah, exactly.
Ninja Turtles. Wow.
So he was not convicted, and they dropped the charge, any terrorism-related charges against him. He had spent a year in custody, and then Hamid was sentenced to decades in prison.
So I know that Hamid must have had a direct appeal, which is, I don't want to get too much into the legal weeds, but you get a chance to do a direct appeal to the higher court before you do your post-conviction motions. What happened with his direct appeal?
Well, an interesting story on that was that we worked with Hamid's trial counsel on post-trial motions, but once they were denied, we took over the appeal. And as we were beginning it, one of the government lawyers came up to me and said, "Are you going to skip the appeal and just go directly to the habeas claim?" Because they knew that the ineffective assistance of counsel claim had to be coming. And I said, "No, I will take our shot at appeal." Had I known that the Ninth Circuit was going to spend 6 years on the appeal, before denying it in a 2-to-1 decision with a really vigorous, vehement dissent from one of the judges, particularly about the phony testimony about the supplication. I might have gone right to the habeas corpus, but the one thing that we did get out of the Ninth Circuit appeal is they said, well, essentially, almost every issue you're raising is forfeited or waived because it wasn't raised by trial counsel below. So, and they essentially said, it's time to go back and start the 2255, the habeas corpus. Hamid was arrested in 2005, convicted in 2006, sentenced in 2007, but it wasn't until 2013 that we got the opinion, the 2-to-1 opinion from the Ninth Circuit, and the sort of invitation in that opinion was, come back to us with all that is not presently in the record. And we spent the year between 2013 and 2014 preparing the habeas corpus, and particularly doing what had not been done before, which is getting investigators on the ground in Pakistan.
Yeah, I didn't realize that you had been with the case that long and that you actually did the direct appeal, and they took so long, realizing that there was going to be a habeas, that it looked like there were significant issues here that could get him out, and they still sat on it for so long. That's weird. But
pretty unusual.
yeah, so I realized so just to explain to people, a direct appeal goes to the higher court, which in this case was the Ninth Circuit. A habeas petition goes back to the original trial judge if they're still there, and a lot of times that's very difficult, and there's a lot of obstacles. You were able to do it because of new evidence, but do you want to talk a little bit about the obstacles that people face when they're trying to do a habeas in general?
Well, what made this unique was we were going to have a very powerful presentation of innocence, which Don will describe in terms of the new evidence. So we were in a different position than many habeas petitioners. But just statistically, if criminal appeals are successful 4 or 5 times out of 100, I would say 2255 petitions, habeas corpus petitions, are probably successful 1 out of 1,000 times. Because the court is, many of them are pro se petitions from prisoners, and there's just an enormous assumption that this is an unsubstantial and insubstantial attempt to take a second bite at the apple. Secondly, habeas petitioners, even indigents, get appointed counsel on appeal. There is no process for getting appointment to prepare a habeas. If the court decides to proceed with it, it can then appoint counsel. So for instance, the work of investigation that had to be done in order to prepare the habeas, there were no funds available to do that from any court appointment. The presumptions against prevailing are tremendous. And secondly, and you really referred to this, you have to go back to the same judge that imposed the original sentence. So you're going back to a judge and saying, Judge, you sentenced this man to decades in prison, and it was an unfair conviction. And that's a huge psychological obstacle on the part of the court to seriously entertaining a habeas.
Yeah, and there's no way generally that somebody in prison can get this new evidence that you need. Can you talk a little bit about how that was? Did you go to Pakistan, either of you, or did you send the investigators, and how were they able to find the people and interview them, these witnesses?
Well, let me just mention how we found them, and then Don will describe the process. So many things went wrong for Hamid initially, but eventually we'll talk about a number of them. Some things went right fortuitously. One was that during the course of an appeal, a woman who was a Pakistani journalist who had a grant to study at Berkeley came to my office to talk about the appeal in the case. And we had a good conversation. And when it became apparent that we were going to have to deal with the habeas, I was able to get in touch with her. She had returned to Pakistan. She had had a good friend who was getting a master's in law at Berkeley at the same year, and she contacted her, and those two became our investigators on the ground in Pakistan.
And so what just to pick up on that, what actually happened in terms of the investigation, and let me just preface this, the appeal was decided in 2013, we lose the appeal. And the appeal, just to clarify, is only concerned with matters that were in the record, that complaints that the defendant has about something that was unfair procedurally or something that happened at the trial, but everything that's in the record can be the subject of the appeal, any error that you claim based on what's in the record. But of course, for instance, in this case, the trial lawyer had never contacted the witnesses in Pakistan. And so there isn't any record about what they would have said. There wasn't anything that you could put up on the appeal because it's outside the record. And so our claim on the what's called the 2255, which lets you go outside the trial record and create a new basis, new evidentiary claims, or get your hands on new evidence. Our claim in this so-called 2255 motion was that the trial lawyer had been ineffective for not presenting the alibi evidence. So what was that alibi evidence? Well, that's where Amna and Miriam came in, and they went in 2014 to Pakistan. As Dennis said, they served as our investigators. They went to Rawalpindi and Babudi being Hamid's hometown. They talked to relatives and friends of Hamid's there, acquaintances. They had them actually come to a house, and they had a sort of a script, of the same questions they would ask all of these potential witnesses. They didn't talk to them or tell them what to say beforehand. It was a fair and objective procedure. And they then prepared a bunch of declarations that we then had with these people in Pakistan who swore, made oaths under Pakistani law and under American law that they were telling the truth. And they gave their stories about where Hamid had been during those key 2 years. And they all attested to the fact that he never left the village for more than a week. And therefore never could have, they don't say that, but of course that was directly contradicted the confession, where it was said, where after Hamid was kind of broken, they led him to say that he had been at a camp anywhere from 3 to 6 months. It couldn't be true if the alibi witnesses were telling the truth. So that's how we got these declarations. And just to shorten up what happened after that, we then went to Judge Burrell, the district court judge, and we moved for what's called summary judgment, meaning you're here, Your Honor, we have these declarations. You can just look at these and you'd recognize that the lawyer was not competent in failing to present this testimony. He said, no, I'm denying this motion. You have to have a hearing. So we go back to, he sends it back to a magistrate judge. We went to a magistrate judge well, actually, we had been already in front of a magistrate judge. After we were denied summary judgment, Magistrate Judge Deborah Barnes was in the case. And that was one of the very fortuitous things that happened in this case, because she was willing, she was interested in the case. She's a very fair jurist, and she gave us an opportunity to really put on a full case. In the hearing, we put on actual live testimony from from people who were here, including Hamid's younger sister, Rahila, his cousin, Jabir Ismail. We put on testimony from, who else did we have that was here?
Those were the two alibi witnesses.
They were the two who were here. And
we also 5 different experts.
Yes, but we also had live testimony from, in kind of a very unusual procedure. We were on teleconferencing, and there were witnesses in Pakistan who testified, on video conference, so that the magistrate judge could see their testimony in the courtroom in Sacramento. So in Pakistan, it was like 7 in the morning, and in Sacramento, it was 7 or 8 in the evening. And we're getting this testimony in front of the judge directly from Pakistan. So we had, long story short, we had 5 live witnesses, 2 of whom were actually here in the Sacramento area. The others came in from Pakistan. and the magistrate judge also considered those declarations again from all the other people who said that Hamid had been in Djibouti the whole time. And in the end, she issued a decision that was one of the bases for her finding in Hamid's favor that his conviction should be thrown out, was that alibi testimony was absolutely compelling. And if a jury had ever seen it, there was no way on earth he would ever have been convicted. And the district court judge, Judge Burrell, the original trial judge, months later, to our surprise, that it happened so quickly, and frankly that it happened that it happened at all was a wonderful surprise. But it happened soon after that he said, "Yeah, I'm going to accept the magistrate judge's finding on that issue and other findings that the magistrate had made in our favor." And that was the day that Hamid's conviction was overturned.
You know, a couple of things on that, and again, the twists of fate. It took so long to get to the evidentiary hearing, but in certain ways, the length of time eventually benefited us in this sense. The original magistrate judge that we had was just terrified of this case, and you know, he wouldn't listen to any evidence about false confessions. He just said, "Well, he confessed." I mean, the evidence of the fact that he never went to a camp from all of these 16 or 17 affidavits just terrified him, and he dealt with the hundreds of pages of arguments in an eight-page order that a first-year law student could have written. But the delay eventually led to Judge Barnes being appointed, and she certainly did us no favors, and in fact ruled against us on a number of critical points. But the government was just absolutely adamant that there must not be an evidentiary hearing in this case. And she was adamant, equally adamant, there is going to be an evidentiary hearing in the case. And that made all the difference in the world, because I don't think the first magistrate would have even given us one. But two fortuities that occurred during the course of this. The hearing was originally supposed to go off in October of 2017. And we were literally driving to Sacramento. And frankly, we had our experts lined up and so forth. But we all felt that it was a little helter-skelter to pull all of this together. And we were relying on the written affidavits, but not on, well, there would have been some live testimony. Oh, yeah. But the prosecutor, I literally got to Sacramento and got the news that the prosecutor had been struck with kidney stones and could not proceed, and the hearing was going to have to be postponed. And it was at that point, for the first time, we said, well, you know, if it's postponed, let's go to Pakistan and take these declarations from these alibi witnesses. And the government said, no, we'll all die, we'll all be shot, you know, by terrorists if we go to Pakistan. So in a reply brief, we said, well, if we can't go to Pakistan, let's do it by teleconferencing. And none of us had ever had any experience of anything like that. And the judge came out, Judge Barnes came out and said, that's a good idea. I don't know why we didn't think of that before. So if you can do it, you know, get your witnesses on teleconferencing. And we met and said, how are we going to get witnesses on teleconferencing from Islamabad? And Martha Birch, a former prosecutor, was a key member of the team, along with Ted Samsel-Jones from our law firm and Layli Shirani, who had been in the case from the beginning when she was a law student. We all pulled together, and Martha said, it turns out, that she had an associate working with her who was Pakistani American. And we talked to
It's Farah,
yeah, and she said, well, you know, I clerked for the Pakistani Supreme Court one summer a couple of years ago, and I worked with a guy, you know, who was then a law intern like myself, and he's got a law practice in Islamabad. Really? So we called him up. His name was Umar Jalani. And we said, Mr. Jalani, you know, this would be, you know, a tremendous imposition. We can't guarantee that we could pay you any money for your work on this, but could you help us with his Pakistani witnesses, and he said, I would be honored to participate in the American system of justice. He set up his law office, set up the telecommunications from there, made sure the witnesses were there at 7 o'clock in the morning, and there were actually 4 of them who testified, two live here, 4 from Pakistan. And, you know, it was an extraordinary experience. That we asked questions in English. The translator was on the witness stand. She'd translate. You'd see this big screen with our witness in Islamabad who would respond in Urdu to the question in Urdu. It would be translated back. And we put on 4 witnesses, and they were very powerful. And one important thing about that is that an affidavit, any judge can view it in the same way. A district court judge could say, well, I can judge the affidavits as well as a magistrate. They're all in paper. But it was only Judge Barnes who had seen these witnesses testify and be subject to cross-examination. So when her finding came out that they were credible, that really sealed the deal.
Because then
Judge... Can I just break in a little bit and explain, or you can explain that in these 2255 cases, initially, if you have a hearing, or initially, even if there's not a hearing, it goes usually to a magistrate judge, and then the magistrate makes findings and recommendations, which goes to a higher judge in the same court, the same district court, but a district court judge. Magistrates are lower judges, and then that district court judge usually adopts the findings and recommendations of the magistrate, but not always. And so it sounds like there was a concern here that the district court, that the magistrate was inclined to grant this, but the district court judge may not have. So it sounds like maybe the magistrate wanted a hearing for that very purpose, that to build a stronger record where she was given some, you know, because she was able to hear the witnesses. So there was, it would be harder to go against that. Is that right?
Yeah, and she made very detailed, thorough findings, very well analyzed, but you know, treated each witness, summarized the testimony of each witness, and said, I found each one of these people credible. And as you said, you're right. Ordinarily, or often, after the magistrate has made findings like that, they'll make a recommendation. They always do, and the recommendation in this case was that the conviction be vacated, in large part because the failure to put on these alibi witnesses had been so devastating to Hamid. We, after Judge Barnes found in our favor on that issue and others, we were fearful, frankly, that Judge Burrell might find a way to try to reject them. However, as Dennis pointed out, because Judge Barnes had made these credibility findings, it would be difficult, very difficult for Judge Burrell to have done anything but adopt the recommendation. That's because in order to reject the credibility findings made by Magistrate Judge Barnes, Judge Burrell would have had to convene a whole new hearing. And that's a big deal, because this was very difficult to put together in the first instance. And the truth is, these witnesses were credible. They were telling the truth. And even if you had done this thing over again, there is just no way that any fair-minded person could say that they were making this up. It was just very compelling material. So yes, it's true that ordinarily a district court will adopt the most or all the findings of the magistrate judge. We were fearful in this case it might not happen, but we didn't really understand how Judge Burrell would be able to reject Judge Barnes's findings on everything or at least on some of the things that findings she made in our favor. It would have been very difficult for him to walk away from. And what was most surprising to me was that he ruled so quickly in our favor after Judge Barnes had submitted her report and recommendation. I think it was a matter of about 4 or 5 months. And we thought it might take more than a year.
Yeah. 4 or 5 months still seems kind of long, but I guess it's not that long compared to how it is a lot of times.
Well, yeah, and Judge Barnes wrote a 116-page opinion. And of course, then the government objected to that in hundreds of pages. A good portion of which was directed, because I wound up testifying at the evidentiary hearing because to the statements that the trial lawyer had made to me about, her lack of knowledge and complete lack of knowledge that she could have obtained testimony by deposition in Pakistan. And so there was a vigorous attack on my testimony at trial, and a lot of the objections to the magistrate's report were based on the, a briefing in front of the magistrate was based on the fact that that nothing I said should be believed, because why would anyone spend 16 or 14 years on a case if they weren't an ideological zealot, who essentially lost their judgment and become so involved in the case, which we were. I should say this: we were, of course, apprehensive about the review by Judge Burrell, simply because, as the New York Times wrote when this was overturned, this was one of the most heralded terrorism convictions ever obtained in the United States. And judge had sentenced this man to decades in prison. The notion of coming along and saying, well, the judicial system got this wrong. The fault wasn't directed at him in particular, as opposed to the quality of representation. But I will say that the opinion that he issued showed no reluctance. I mean, no. It absolutely embraced the hearing findings below. And while it is true that judges normally accept the recommendation in 2255 habeas cases, that's because the recommendation almost always is to deny the petition.
And affirm the conviction.
Right, and affirm the conviction. So you're in a different ball game when you've got a recommendation to overturn a conviction. But not only was there no hesitancy, although Judge Burrell did not embrace all of the findings of the magistrate, there was no hesitancy or ambiguity about affirming the credibility of these witnesses. But to everyone's great credit, and I'll give the government credit for this, that came out on July 30th, and the government did not oppose, and Judge Burrell acted quickly to order Hamid's release, because technically the government could have sought to appeal the ruling or announced that they were going to retry the case immediately, so Hamid should remain in custody pending a retrial. But he walked out the door 9 or 10 days later, and we saw him a day or two after that, and he can tell you about that. But it's worth a career to see one victory like this.
I hear you. Yeah. And out of about 1,000 of these terrorism cases that I've studied, I think only 1 or 2 won on direct appeal, and only your case and one other involving a Pakistani, Uzair Paracha, won on a 2255. So it's very rare, and congratulations on that great victory. And then why do you think after Hamid was released, and I'm glad the government didn't fight that after you won the habeas with the district judge, why do you think that the government waited so long to actually drop the charges? Did they have to get approval from higher up, or what was up with that?
Yes, I mean, that's our take on it. I think
they consistently said that this had to be approved by Washington, and that it was taking a long time to do that. The U.S. attorneys that we were working with said they had made their internal assessment, but now it would have to get approved in Washington. And of course, we thought 2 things. One, now we were deep in the Trump administration. Where would that go at the Department of Justice? But the other thing, what we were convinced of, is that if the government was going to absolutely drop the case, they would rather do it when everybody had forgotten the name of Hamid Hayat, and there'd be as little attention as possible paid to the dismissal. And essentially, and of course, they did not admit that it was an unfair conviction. They just said, given the amount of time that's expired since then, we're not going to go ahead with a retrial. But Hamid, was on tenterhooks the whole time. it was impossible for him to really restart his life without some assurance that he wouldn't be back in the midst of a criminal prosecution.
All right. Well,
I will say it's a case they never could have won on a retrial, never. And it really does make me wonder, you know, at the front end of this whole thing, it's scandalous in my opinion that they never investigated. They never took the time to investigate whether there really had been a terrorist camp in Balakot, which was the prosecution's theory of the case at trial. They never sent anybody from the CIA or the FBI up to Balakot to see whether or not on the ground they could verify the existence of that camp. And they never talked to any of these people in Pakistan. You know, when he says when he was interrogated for hours, he was saying he had never been to such a camp, you know, and that he was in Babuti and so forth. Well, why? And you know, only after hours and hours did they get them with these leading questions to get him to incriminate himself. Why wouldn't any responsible prosecution team go out and check out to see whether there really were alibi witnesses or people who could account for his whereabouts? They never did that, and I think that's appalling.
and that makes me ask that in addition to the ineffective assistance arguments with all the alibi witnesses, did you also argue prosecutorial misconduct?
We did in terms of the closing argument. You know, it was made more difficult, for instance, on appeal because there was no objection to the false. They made false statements about their expert witnesses and so forth. Let me just mention two things because they can be important to someone who's looking at this case again. One of the gravest, errors and on the part of trial counsel was that this was a national security case. And you cannot handle a national security case without a security clearance. Because if you don't have a security clearance, you cannot participate in any discussion of evidence that the government isn't turning over or evidence that it is turning over in terms of where it came from and so forth and so on. And the government became concerned in this case and said to the judge pre-trial, because they were worried about the whole thing being sunk by this, these lawyers haven't gotten a security clearance, and you got to somehow take waivers or whatever else because we're not going to be able to have a valid conviction if a appellate lawyer can say they never even got a security clearance, they couldn't participate in discussions of the evidence and so forth. And the judge actually just ripped into the lawyers and said, what are you doing? No lawyer in a terrorism case can try a case without a security clearance. And the father's lawyer said, well, why don't we do this? Why don't we, because the judge offered to get a lawyer with a security clearance to join the team so they'd have one. And the father's lawyer said, no, don't do that. Let's just wait and see if we need one as the case goes along. And the judge bounced off the wall, Judge Riordan, and said, I'm going to stop the trial in the middle to try and find a lawyer with a security clearance. And so what the father's lawyer said, with the acquiescence of Hamid's lawyers, well, that's okay if the government ever objects to anything on security grounds under CIPA, that the evidence is confidential, we'll withdraw the question. So when trial counsel said to the FBI agents, well, did you ever go investigate the camp? Objection, Your Honor, CIPA, confidential. And that was the end of it. And so we were, a big part of the appeal dealt with the deficiencies in terms of CIPA, and the trial lawyer did not know that under CIPA, the government can object not only to you trying to get their evidence, it can block you from presenting your own evidence on the grounds that it's classified. So one lesson was never do one of these cases without a security clearance.
Yeah.
The other thing was that there was no expert presented at the trial about this supplication, and the government's expert just made up this notion that, I mean, how could anyone in the world ever know? It's like saying everybody who carries a security card is by that fact, you can deduce that they're a terrorist. I mean, this is such a common practice. But in the post-trial proceedings, we did bring in, with the acceptance of the trial lawyer, one of the world's great experts on Islam, Riordan. But he had not been presented at trial, but we were able to bring him back for the evidentiary hearing. And it was just a moment where he was on the stand, and I said to him, what would happen if you took out your cell phone and put in this supplication in the prayer into your cell phone? What would happen? And he said, oh, well, you'd get several thousand YouTubes of imams instructing their communities on what this means and its protection as a device, you know, when you travel and so forth and so on. And it just, he just decimated. He's now at Princeton. He was at NYU at the time of the trial. I had a degree from Oxford. Brilliant, brilliant man. And they attempted to cross-examine him by going back to the beginnings of Islam. And let me just say, the bodies were strewn on the floor once he responded to the questions on cross-examination. Just a great, and you know, Richard Leo was our expert on false confessions. We had great experts on ineffective assistance of counsel. We were just really fortunate to be able to put together both the legal team, the investigators, the paralegals. It was an enormous and complicated hearing, and but all of it, I think, proved necessary to overturn this conviction.
Wow, and congratulations again. I think we could have a whole webinar on how secret evidence is misused in these kinds of cases. I have a lot of experience with it myself, where the trial attorney in Yasin Araf's case did get a security clearance and still didn't get to see any of the evidence that resulted in decisions being made by the judge. And we found out later that evidence was false. There's so many abuses there because of the secrecy, and also with the ways that prejudicial evidence, like the prayers, like the word jihad in some cases, like a lot of things that are just normal things in Islam are totally misrepresented and used to make people sound like terrorists when they're not. So there's so many things that are common to a lot of these cases, and then you had extra ones here, you with the false confession, and I'm just so grateful to you guys for the hard work you did for so many years, and we're successful. That's wonderful. We have a couple of questions. Actually, they're from the same person. Elizabeth Block asks, why does the FBI do this? Do they have, go after people like this? Do they have quotas? Do they get promoted if they do it? Have they just nothing better to do? Or is the FBI just a bunch of ideological zealots? Well, I could say a lot about that, but I'll let you guys respond to that.
Well, Don may have a reaction as well. My take on it was this. And understandably, the FBI changed enormously after 9/11, and rightfully so. I mean, it demonstrated that the external threats were real, and Mueller essentially turned the FBI into a security organization, a national security organization, and every FBI office, no matter where it was, it could be in a hamlet, had an anti-terrorism squad or specialist or whatever else. It was not likely that you were going to get a lot of this in the Eastern District of California with Sacramento, but it certainly wasn't likely you were going to get any of it in Lodi, California, where Hamid and his family was living at the time. And I think there was just this tremendous, we haven't talked about much about, you mentioned at the beginning, the provocateur who told the FBI this completely false story about how he had seen Ayman al-Zawahiri, the number 2 person in Al-Qaeda, lecturing or praying at the mosque in Lodi, in 1999, and they brought him on for that. I think there was a tremendous sense of excitement that they might be into something like this, and I believe that once they got this statement from Hamid and his father, there was this huge raid on Lodi, helicopters and guns and the whole community was terrorized that they were going to find weapons or something that connected Hamid to the attendants at a camp in Pakistan, and they had nothing.
Yes.
But
Well, I was going to say, just on that point, some of the testimony at the hearing was given by Rahila Hayat, who I said she was 10 years old at the time that Hamid was arrested, I believe. At any rate, she was very young, and she was at the home when after Hamid had been interrogated, and they thought they were dealing with a terror, or they convinced themselves that they had a real terrorist on their hands. When they came in and came to the door of the Hayat home and broke it down, and there were, Rahila describes in her testimony how they came in and put a gun to her head and a gun to her mother's head, and it's just a chilling, thing to imagine. It was, I don't know. She described it as like ants coming out of an anthill as they moved through the house, destroying everything and tearing everything apart, and thinking they were going to find a cache of weapons, machine guns, whatever, explosives, and they came up with nothing. So they had committed, and my personal feeling was also, I know Dennis mentioned this announcement that Al-Qaeda was present in Lodi. I think the U.S. Attorney, if I'm not mistaken, made some announcement about.
So subsequent to that, the Frontline did a documentary,
right.
And Lowell Bergman quizzed him, and he said, well, that was a mistake, because no, there was no connection to Al-Qaeda. But once you make an announcement like that,
Yeah.
Can you imagine somebody coming along and saying, never mind?
Never mind. And I honestly think that they had way overplayed their hand. They'd been bamboozled by this informant, and had committed themselves to this theory that there was this, terrorist threat in Lodi, California. When it came up empty, who did they seize on? The one guy that that was malleable and that they could talk into, who went along with their theory. But I think that they were going after very big fish, and they ended up with a small one, and they couldn't let go. And I think a lot of it was about saving face.
Yeah, and let me say this: there's work being done on a significant documentary on this case, and one of the things that I predict will surface in that documentary is that there were people within the government who said, we're in trouble because we've announced this huge prosecution and we think we're going to lose. And it's going to damage the credibility of the anti-terrorism movement. And they counseled, I think, against going forward on it. And the fact is that Hamid had been represented by the federal public defender in Sacramento, he wouldn't have ever been convicted. Had he had experienced trial counsel, it would have needed a team such as the one we put together, and his trial counsel spoke Urdu, and she could have been an important member of that team in terms of dealing with the both verbal and written communications in Urdu. But it demanded a highly qualified and resourced team of lawyers, and it had just the opposite. I mean, the notion of, this was as complex a federal criminal prosecution as you could have possibly had, especially given its international aspects. And, the notion of a lawyer who had never stepped foot in a trial context, much less a federal criminal trial context. And as I say, the fact that the jury still had profound doubts, and the foreman was found to have engaged in misconduct, but it was deemed harmless. But for were he well represented, this case would have ended in 2006.
Yeah, it reminds me a lot of the Yassine Aref case, which I was involved with, but I don't have time to talk about that. But I remember seeing the PBS Frontline documentary you mentioned while we were working on that case, and we were not able to get Yassine a new trial, but at least he served his sentence and is released now. I guess we're going to wrap it up now. We're about out of time. I wanted to go I wanted to give Hamid a chance for any closing thoughts if he can get back on. Maybe I don't see his camera, but I guess I'll ask the two of you first for any closing thoughts, and then we'll try to get Hamid. I think he's coming back.
Yeah, my comment would be this: the most important person in securing this victory was Hamid, because but for his strength of character to last through 14 years of confinement, this case would have gone away. So not only did he deserve his freedom, he did an enormous amount to earn it. Simply by his faith and perseverance and the character he displayed during those 13, 14 years in prison.
And I guess I'd just add, I add to that, I'm just very grateful to have been able to work on the case with our entire team, including Dennis, who really led this thing from the beginning and just had a very comprehensive.
You may be feeling concerned about the coronavirus, also known as COVID-19.
I'm sorry. Anyway, I was just grateful to have worked with Dennis, who really saw this through from the beginning and kind of coordinated the whole thing, as well as with everyone else on our team: Martha Bursch, Layla Shamrani, Ted Samsel Jones, Farah Rizvi, everybody else who lent a hand, and also I mean, it really was a team effort, and very, very intense, but we coordinated well, I think, and also to the family, because they were so united and so helpful to us. The way they came together and helped us and kept their faith in us and kept the faith behind Hamid. It was really remarkable and great to see.
And we also had support both from CARE,
Yes.
the Council on American Islamic Relations in Sacramento, and the Muslim Legal Fund of America as well, at different stages in the case.
Yeah, Basim El-Kara.
Yeah.
CARE, yeah.
Great for that.
All right. Thank you both. And Hamid, are you there? Do you want to say any closing thoughts?
Yeah, I'm here. For some reason my camera's not working, and sorry, I was on some kind of training for my job. If you guys heard that, so I'm sorry. Yes, thank you very much. I would like to thank my legal team. I would like to thank you guys, CCF, all the organizations, all my supporters. Thank you very much. For me to be a free man, it's because of people like you guys, all the hard work and support. Thank you very much. I appreciate it. I owe you guys my freedom.
All right. Thanks to all of you, and thanks to our listeners and viewers, and congratulations again. And I hope we can work together in the future.
Absolutely.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I appreciate it.